The first contact didn't come from a radar return. It came from a thermal bloom, a faint heat signature lifting off the Iranian coast at 0347 local time, drifting south toward the Strait of Hormuz at an altitude no commercial aircraft would ever fly. Then another. Then 6 more. Within 90 seconds, the Aegis combat system aboard a single American destroyer was tracking what its operators would later describe, in the careful language of after-action reports, as a saturation event. 200 contacts. One ship. One narrow corridor of water that carries roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil. And somewhere, 300 nautical miles to the south, a carrier strike group that was deliberately, pointedly, not moving to intervene. That last detail is the one Tehran tried hardest to bury. Because the visible story that night was simple enough: a swarm attack repelled, a destroyer victorious, a choke point held. The hidden story was something else entirely. Something about why a single Arleigh Burke-class warship was left alone in the most contested water on Earth, with the nearest fighter cover an hour away by afterburner, and the nearest replenishment vessel further still. Something about what the United States was willing to risk to see. Because the destroyer wasn't a defender that night. It was an instrument. A sensor. Bait, if you want to use the uglier word, though no one inside the Pentagon would ever say it that way. To understand why, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz had become in the weeks before. The corridor narrows to 21 nautical miles at its tightest point, with Iranian territory on one side and Omani waters on the other. Inside that gap sit the shipping lanes, 2 of them, each barely 2 miles wide. A tanker passing through is, for roughly 2 hours, inside the engagement envelope of every coastal anti-ship battery Iran has spent 4 decades building into the cliffs above. Silkworm derivatives. Nor missiles. The newer Gotter variants with extended seekers. And underneath all of it, the layered drone infrastructure, Shahid 130 SXS, Mohajer 10s, and the smaller loitering munitions that had been quietly multiplying at dispersed launch sites along the coast for the better part of a year. American intelligence had been watching the build-up. That much is now clear. What is less clear is when, exactly, the decision was made to stop merely watching. The destroyer's name doesn't matter for the story. What matters is that it was operating under a tasking order that placed it inside the strait at a time when standard force protection doctrine would have kept it further out. Its escorts, there should have been escorts, were instead repositioned to the east, screening a logistics convoy that, according to one analyst familiar with the routing, didn't actually need that level of protection. The geometry was wrong. Deliberately wrong. A retired surface warfare officer, asked later about the deployment pattern, described it in 3 words. Someone wanted contact. The swarm came in 3 waves. The first was the smallest, perhaps 30 drones, low and fast, hugging the water in a way that suggested operators with recent combat experience. They weren't trying to hit the destroyer. They were trying to map its response. Every interceptor launched, every radar lock, every electronic countermeasure deployed, all of it was data, streaming back to ground stations along the Iranian coast in real time. That was the visible attack. What was actually happening underneath it took longer to understand. Because while the destroyer's Spy-1 radar was burning through targets in the upper hemisphere, something else was moving in the lower one. A submarine, one of Iran's Gotter-class midget boats, possibly 2, had transited out of Bandar Abbas the previous evening and gone silent. American P-8 Poseidons had tracked them to the edge of the deep water channel and then lost them, which is exactly what is supposed to happen with diesel-electric submarines in shallow, acoustically cluttered water. They become holes in the ocean. Holes in the ocean don't matter, until they do. The second wave brought the number of airborne contacts to roughly 120. The destroyer's magazine was finite. Standard Missile 2s, Standard Missile CXS, ESSMs in quad-packed cells. The exact loadout is classified, but the math is not. An Arleigh Burke carries 96 vertical launch cells. Some are reserved for land attack Tomahawks. Some for anti-submarine rockets. The actual air defense inventory available that night was, by any reasonable estimate, fewer interceptors than there were inbound drones. This is the calculation that planners in Bahrain had to have made in advance. Because they sent the ship in anyway. The reason sits in a phrase that has been quietly circulating through naval war colleges for the last 3 years, the cost exchange problem. A Shahid 136 drone costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 to build. A standard missile, 2 costs over $2 million. If Iran can force the United States to trade $2 million interceptors for $50,000 drones, the math eventually breaks the defender, not in any single engagement, but across a sustained campaign. Tehran understands this. Washington understands this. The question that night, in the Strait, was whether the United States had a solution that Iran didn't know about yet. It did. The third wave is where the engagement stops resembling anything in the public record and starts resembling something else. Roughly 40 drones in that wave never reached weapons release range. They didn't fall to missiles. They fell to something quieter, a layered electronic warfare envelope that appears to have been generated not from the destroyer alone, but from an asset operating somewhere north of it. An asset that was not, officially, in the Strait that night. A submarine commander, speaking years later in a different context, once described his job as being the part of the equation the enemy forgot to solve for. That phrase is worth holding on to. Because the question that nobody in Tehran wanted asked the following morning was this: if a single destroyer absorbed a 200-drone saturation attack and emerged operational, then either the drone swarm was less effective than advertised, or the destroyer wasn't operating alone. Both possibilities are strategically catastrophic for Iran. The first undermines a decade of investment in asymmetric maritime denial. The second confirms that the United States has positioned undersea and electronic warfare assets inside the strait that Iranian intelligence cannot reliably detect, which means every future calculation about closing the corridor has to be made against an enemy whose actual order of battle is unknown. This is why the showdown was hidden. Not because Tehran lost. Because the engagement revealed something Tehran could not afford to have revealed. By dawn, the destroyer was still on station. The drone wreckage drifting in the channel was, by some accounts, photographed by commercial satellites before Iranian recovery vessels could reach it. The carrier strike group to the south had not moved. The submarines that left Bandar Abbas the previous evening had not returned to port. And the Strait of Hormuz, technically, remained open. But the geometry had shifted. Because the real outcome of that night wasn't measured in drones destroyed or missiles expended. It was measured in what each side now knew about the other, and what each side now knew the other knew. Iran had revealed the structure of its swarm doctrine, the spacing, the wave timing, the electronic signatures of its command links. The United States had revealed less, but it also revealed something more dangerous, that it was willing to place a single high-value warship inside the kill envelope of 200 drones, because it had calculated, correctly, that the warship would survive. That confidence is itself a form of deterrence. And it is also a form of provocation. A senior planner at Fifth Fleet, asked obliquely about the night's events some weeks later, offered only one observation. The strait isn't the choke point. The choke point is whoever runs out of patience first. What he didn't say, but what the operational pattern since has implied, is that the United States believes it has more patience. Or more accurately, that it has built a sensor and strike architecture in the Gulf that allows it to absorb provocations that would have triggered a war a decade ago. Carrier rotations are now shorter and more frequent. ISR coverage from MQ-4C Triton drones operating out of the UAE is nearly continuous. The undersea picture, by every available indication, has been quietly transformed. And yet, Iran's drone inventory continues to grow. The launch sites continue to disperse. The midget submarine fleet has expanded, not contracted. And the anti-ship missile coastline, the cliffs above the strait, where the batteries are buried in hardened revetments, has, in the last 18 months, received upgrades that American intelligence is still working to characterize. Which raises the question that the visible story of that night was designed to obscure. If a 200-drone swarm was Iran's probing attack, if it was, in the language of the planners, a reconnaissance by fire, then what is the actual attack supposed to look like? The honest answer is that nobody knows. The drone swarm tested American sensors and interceptor depth. The midget submarines tested American undersea detection. The coastal missile batteries have not yet been tested at all. And the doctrine that ties all three together, the swarm, the submarine, the shore battery, fused into a single coordinated strike, has been rehearsed in Iranian exercises but never executed against a real American formation. That word is the one that keeps planners in Bahrain awake. Because the strategic logic of the strait is not stable. It is balanced on a series of assumptions, that Iran will not escalate to a level that invites direct American retaliation, that the United States will not strike first against assets that have not yet been used, that the global economy can absorb temporary disruption but not sustained closure. Each of those assumptions has a half-life. And the events of that night, whatever else they were, suggested that the half-life is shortening. The destroyer eventually rotated out. Another took its place. The carrier strike group repositioned, slowly, in a pattern that suggested neither retreat nor escalation but something harder to read, a deliberate ambiguity, calibrated to keep Tehran uncertain about whether the next provocation would be answered with another silent absorption or with something Iran has not yet seen. And somewhere beneath the surface of the Gulf, the assets that were never officially there continue to operate. The holes in the ocean. The parts of the equation that the enemy is supposed to forget to solve for. The strait remains open. The oil continues to flow. The headlines moved on within a news cycle, as they always do. But the choke point, the real one, the patience choke point, the one the planner mentioned, that one is narrower than it was. And it gets narrower every time a swarm lifts off the coast and a single American warship is left, deliberately, to face it alone. What happened that night was not a battle. It was a measurement. Both sides took readings. Both sides learned things they will not publicly admit they learned. And both sides walked away with a clearer picture of how the next confrontation will begin, and a much less clear picture of how it will end. If you want to understand what's actually happening in the Gulf right now, the visible engagements are not the place to look. Look at the deployments that don't make sense. The escorts that are positioned wrong. The submarines that leave port and don't come back on schedule. The carriers that hold station when doctrine says they should move. That's where the real story is. Subscribe for more strategic breakdowns like this one. Hit the like button if you want this kind of analysis to keep reaching the people who care about what's actually happening beneath the headlines. And watch the next documentary, the one on the submarine deployments nobody is talking about, because the strait was only the surface. What's moving underneath it is the story that hasn't been told yet.